priest touches dying boy in the hospital, and what happens horrifies everyone. The scream echoed through the dimly lit corridor of St. Michael's Memorial Hospital, piercing the usual midnight silence. 8-year-old Tommy Miller's voice had changed deeper, darker, almost inhuman. "He's coming for me," the boy whispered, his small body contorting in ways that defied nature. Emily Parker, the night nurse, froze at the doorway, watching in horror as shadows seemed to dance across the walls. Father Michael Davidson's weathered hands gripped his rosary tighter, his prayers growing more urgent. In that moment they all knew this was no ordinary battle for a child's life. But St. Michael's Memorial Hospital stood like a weathered sentinel on the outskirts of Millbrook, Massachusetts, its red brick facade bearing witness to decades of human suffering and healing. The morning fog rolled in from the nearby woods, wrapping the century-old building in a ghostly shroud that seemed to whisper of its troubled past. Local residents spoke in hushed tones about the strange occurrences within its walls, though few dared to voice their concerns openly. The hospital's reputation had once been sterling, serving the small community with distinction since 1924, but recent years had cast a shadow over its pristine image. Whispers of unexplained deaths, particularly among children, had begun to circulate. The third floor's pediatric ward, where Tommy Miller now lay fighting for his life, had become a place that even veteran staff members approached with unease. Dr. James Harrison, the hospital administrator, maintained a facade of professional competence, his silver hair and tailored suits projecting an image of trustworthiness. Yet behind closed doors he presided over a system that prioritized profit over patient care. Budget cuts had left the night shift perpetually understaffed, and equipment maintenance regularly delayed. The old chapel, once a place of solace for patients and families, had been shuttered for renovation 3 years ago, though no work had ever begun. The town of Millbrook itself seemed to mirror the hospital's decline. Once a prosperous mill town, it had fallen on hard times after the textile factory closed. Many storefronts along Main Street stood empty, their windows collecting dust. The remaining residents clung to their faith, filling St. Mary's Church every Sunday, praying for better days while watching their children leave for bigger cities. The pediatric ward told its own story of neglect. Faded cartoon characters peeled from the walls, their cheerful expressions now seeming more grotesque than comforting. The night shift was particularly challenging, when the old building's heating system groaned and shadows seemed to take on lives of their own. Nurses spoke of cold spots that appeared without explanation, and monitors that malfunctioned only to work perfectly when maintenance arrived. But the hospital board, comprised of Millbrook's remaining elite, turned a blind eye to the mounting problems. They dismissed complaints about understaffing and ignored the increasing number of incident reports. The hospital's charity care program had been quietly reduced, leaving many of Millbrook's poorest residents without access to proper medical care. It was into this environment that Tommy Miller had been admitted 3 weeks ago, his case initially seeming routine, a severe case of pneumonia in an otherwise healthy child. But as days passed, his symptoms had evolved into something the medical staff couldn't explain. His medical chart grew thick with conflicting observations and failed treatments, each page telling the story of a child slipping away despite modern medicine's best efforts. The night shift had become particularly dreaded in the pediatric ward since Tommy's arrival. Staff members requested transfers, claiming health issues or family obligations. Those who remained spoke of strange sounds emanating from his room, of equipment malfunctioning, and of an oppressive darkness that seemed to follow visitors long after they left the ward. For years, the hospital's basement archives held records that might have shed light on similar cases, children who had shown unexplainable symptoms, whose illnesses had defied medical science. But these records remained locked away, their existence known only to a few long-serving staff members who had learned to keep their knowledge to themselves. As autumn descended on Millbrook, bringing with it an early darkness and bitter wind, St. Michael's Memorial Hospital stood as a testament to institutional decay and forgotten promises. Yet within its walls, a battle was about to unfold, one that would force the institution's darkest secrets into the light and test the boundaries between faith and science, good and evil, life and death. Sarah Miller sat beside her son's hospital bed, her once vibrant blue eyes now dulled by exhaustion and worry. At 34, she bore the weight of single motherhood with quiet dignity, working 2 jobs to provide for Tommy since her husband's abandonment 3 years ago. Her fingers, calloused from long hours as a waitress, gently stroked Tommy's pale hand, while her other hand clutched a worn rosary, a family heirloom that had become her lifeline in recent weeks. Tommy Miller, just 8 years old, lay unnaturally still in the oversized hospital bed. Before his illness, he had been the light of Millbrook Elementary School, a bright, curious child with a talent for drawing and an infectious laugh that could brighten any room. His artwork still decorated his hospital room walls, though the cheerful scenes now seemed to mock the gravity of his condition. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his normally rosy cheeks had grown hollow, giving his young face an unsettling maturity. Emily Parker moved through the hospital corridors with practiced efficiency, her 28 years of life having led her to this crossroads. A graduate of Boston University's nursing program, she had chosen to return to her hometown of Millbrook despite more lucrative opportunities elsewhere. Her logical mind and scientific training had always been her compass, though lately the inexplicable events surrounding Tommy's case had begun to shake her carefully constructed worldview. Her long auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her green eyes carried a sharp intelligence that missed little, including the strange shadows that seemed to follow her through the pediatric ward. Father Michael Davidson's weathered face told the story of his 60 years, each line earned through both joy and suffering. 20 years ago, he had been a different man, a successful businessman with a loving wife and daughter. The loss of his child to an inexplicable illness had driven him first to despair, then to the priesthood, seeking answers in faith when medicine had failed him. His daughter Jessica had been the same age as Tommy when darkness claimed her, a parallel that haunted his every prayer for the boy. The priest's collar sat heavily on his neck these days, as the diocese questioned his increasing involvement in Tommy's case. His superior, Bishop Roberts, had warned him about performing unauthorized prayers of deliverance, but Father Michael would not turn away from what he recognized in Tommy's eyes. The same shadows that had once danced in Jessica's gaze now lurked in the boy's, and this time he was determined to fight them. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the lead pediatrician, represented the bridge between Emily's world of science and the inexplicable events unfolding in Tommy's room. At 55, she had seen enough in her career to know that medicine didn't have all the answers, yet her reputation and position demanded she maintain professional skepticism. Her silver-streaked black hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave her an air of authority that helped mask her growing unease with the case. The night shift staff had their own hierarchy, led by charge nurse Robert "Bobby" Thompson, whose 20 years of experience had taught him when to look the other way. His massive frame and gentle demeanor made him a favorite among young patients, though lately he avoided Tommy's room, claiming allergies but unable to hide the fear in his eyes. These individuals, each carrying their own burdens and beliefs, found themselves drawn together by Tommy's mysterious illness. Their lives, previously running on parallel tracks, began to intersect in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, science, and the thin line between light and darkness. As autumn winds rattled the hospital windows and darkness fell earlier each day, they would discover that their greatest challenge lay not in fighting an external force, but in confronting their own fears, doubts, and the secrets they each harbored. Or in the battle for Tommy's soul, each would be forced to question what they were willing to sacrifice for salvation. The night Tommy Miller's condition first manifested its true nature began like any other on the pediatric ward. The boy had been drifting in and out of consciousness, his fever hovering stubbornly at 103, despite aggressive treatment. Sarah dozed fitfully in the chair beside his bed, her hand never leaving his when the first signs appeared. At precisely 3:07 a.m., the temperature in room 307 plummeted. Emily Parker, making her routine checks, watched her breath form clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The monitors, usually steadily beeping, began to emit erratic patterns that defied medical explanation. Tommy's vital signs fluctuated wildly, heart rate spiking, blood pressure dropping, yet the boy showed no signs of distress. "Mum," Tommy whispered, his voice carrying an odd resonance that made Emily's skin crawl. "Mom, they're here again." Sarah jerked awake, years of maternal instinct overriding exhaustion. Tommy's eyes were open, but they seemed to focus on something beyond the hospital room's walls. "The shadows," he continued, "they're dancing. They want me to dance too." Emily reached for the call button, but it was dead. The overhead lights began to flicker, casting strange patterns across the walls. Medical training warred with instinct as she watched shadows move against the natural fall of light, forming shapes that seemed almost human before dissolving back into darkness. Sarah clutched her rosary tighter, her prayers a desperate whisper in the gathering gloom. "Please, God, not my boy. Please, not my Tommy." The child's body suddenly went rigid, his back arching at an impossible angle. When he spoke again, his voice had changed deeper, older, carrying echoes of something ancient and malevolent. "Your God can't help him now." The voice that wasn't Tommy's growled. The words seemed to reverberate through the room, rattling the windows and medical equipment. Sarah screamed, and Emily found herself backing toward the door, every scientific principle she'd ever learned crumbling in the face of what she was witnessing. Tommy's body relaxed just as suddenly as it had tensed, but now dark marks began appearing on his skin, bruises forming in patterns that looked unsettlingly like handprints. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and his lips moved in words Emily couldn't understand but recognized as no language she'd ever heard. The night shift security guard, David Williams, burst into the room, drawn by Sarah's continued screams. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing Tommy levitating several inches above his bed, the sheets twisted around him like a shroud. The sight proved too much for the veteran guard, who crossed himself and backed out of the room, muttering prayers. Emily forced herself to approach the bed, her medical training finally overriding her terror. The boy's skin was ice-cold despite the fever readings on the monitor. As she reached for his pulse, Tommy's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was impossibly strong for an 8-year-old weakened by illness. "They're coming for me," Tommy said, his voice now his own but filled with a terrible certainty. "They're hungry, and they've waited so long. They say I'm not the first. There were others here in this hospital, so many others." His eyes focused on Emily with frightening clarity. "You see them too, don't you? The lost ones. They follow you in the shadows." Emily yanked her hand free, her heart pounding. Because she did see them, had always seen them, though she'd spent years convincing herself it was just her imagination. The fleeting shapes in her peripheral vision, the whispers in empty rooms, the faces that sometimes peered from mirrors before vanishing like smoke. Sarah's prayers had risen to a fever pitch, and somewhere in the distance church bells began to toll, though it was hours before dawn. The lights stabilized, and Tommy collapsed back onto his bed, appearing once again like nothing more than a very sick little boy. But the bruises remained, dark accusations against his pale skin, and the temperature in the room remained frigid. Emily backed out of the room on shaking legs, her worldview shattered. As she reached the nurse's station, she found herself dialing a number she'd seen posted on the hospital's bulletin board, but had always dismissed with scientific skepticism. Father Michael Davidson, the local priest known for his work with troubled cases. Father Michael Davidson arrived at St. Michael's Memorial just as dawn was breaking, his black coat billowing in the autumn wind. The call from Emily Parker had been brief but urgent enough to pull him from his morning prayers. As he crossed the hospital threshold, the weight of memory pressed down on him, the same halls where, 20 years ago, he had watched helplessly as his daughter Jessica slipped away. He found Emily pacing the nurse's station, her professional composure cracked by the night's events. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup. Sarah Miller sat nearby, tear-stained and exhausted, while Dr. Sullivan reviewed Tommy's charts with growing frustration. "His symptoms don't make any medical sense," Dr. Sullivan was saying, her voice tight with professional frustration. "The bruises appeared without trauma, his blood work is all over the place, and these temperature readings are impossible." She looked up as Father Michael approached, her expression hardening. "With all due respect, Father, this is a medical facility, not a church." "Margaret," Father Michael said softly, using her first name. They had known each other since Jessica's illness. "You've seen the reports. You know this isn't the first case." Dr. Sullivan flinched, and Emily's head snapped up, attention caught by the exchange. Sarah rose from her chair, swaying slightly with exhaustion. "Please help my son," she pleaded. "The doctors, they keep running tests, but he's getting worse." And after last night her voice broke, and Emily stepped forward to steady her. The group moved to Tommy's room, where the boy lay sleeping. The morning light cast gentle shadows, but they seemed to move against the sun's natural path. Father Michael approached the bed, his hand instinctively reaching for his collar. The temperature dropped as he drew closer, his breath visible in the sudden cold. "The church requires significant documentation before considering any official intervention," Father Michael explained, his eyes never leaving Tommy. "But I'm not here in an official capacity. I'm here because 20 years ago I saw these same signs in my daughter's eyes." Dr. Sullivan inhaled sharply. Jessica's case was different, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "The circumstances." "They were exactly the same," Father Michael interrupted, his voice firm. "The unexplained bruises, the voice changes, the impossible strength. You were there, Margaret. You saw what happened." Tommy stirred in his sleep, whimpering. The monitors began their erratic beeping again, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen. Emily moved closer to the bed, her nursing instincts warring with her growing awareness of things she'd spent years trying not to see. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone." All eyes turned to her as she struggled with words. "I see things. Always have. Shadows that move wrong. Faces in mirrors. And lately, here in the hospital." She swallowed hard. "The lost ones. The children who never left." Father Michael's expression softened with understanding, while Dr. Sullivan's professional mask cracked slightly. Sarah reached for her son's hand, her rosary wrapped tightly around both their fingers. "The hospital board won't approve any unofficial treatments," Dr. Sullivan warned, but her eyes held a question rather than a dismissal. "And Bishop Roberts has already expressed concerns about your methods, Father." "Then we don't tell them," Father Michael replied simply. "Margaret, you know what's at stake. You were there when Jessica, he couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to." The memory of his daughter's final moments hung heavy in the air. Tommy's monitors suddenly went wild, and his eyes snapped open completely black, like endless pits. "They remember you, priest," he said in that terrible other voice. "They remember your daughter. Such a sweet soul. She fought so hard." Father Michael staggered as if struck, but his face set with determination. Sarah began to pray, her voice trembling but growing stronger. Emily found herself reaching for Tommy's other hand, while Dr. Sullivan watched, her scientific worldview crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. "This stops now," Father Michael declared, reaching for his worn Bible. "We fight, together, whatever the cost." The first confrontation came without warning, 3 days after Father Michael's arrival. Tommy's condition had deteriorated rapidly, despite or perhaps because of the increased attention his case was receiving. The hospital administration had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Father Michael's constant presence, and rumors spread through the staff like wildfire. Dr. James Harrison, the hospital administrator, strode into Tommy's room that afternoon, flanked by 2 members of the hospital board and a child services representative. Mrs. Miller," he announced, his voice carrying practiced authority, "we have serious concerns about your son's care. Our staff reports," he paused, consulting a document, "unauthorized religious practices, refusal of standard treatments, and potential psychological abuse." Sarah stood from her chair, her face pale but determined. "I've refused nothing," she protested. "Every test, every treatment you've suggested, we've tried them all. Nothing works. Father Michael is the only one who seems to help." The Child Services representative, a sharp-faced woman named Linda Matthews, stepped forward. "We have reports of your son being restrained, of screaming in the night, of claims about supernatural entities. In our professional opinion, your emotional state may be compromising your ability to make medical decisions for your child." Before Sarah could respond, the monitors around Tommy began to shriek. The boy's body convulsed violently, his back arching off the bed at an impossible angle. The fluorescent lights overhead exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into shadow. Through the chaos, Tommy's voice rose, not the voice of a child, but something ancient and filled with malice. "Poor little Jessica," the voice taunted, its words seeming to come from every corner of the room. "She screamed for her daddy right until the end. Will Tommy scream too?" The temperature plummeted, frost forming on the windows despite the autumn heat outside. Dr. Harrison stumbled backward, his face ashen. Linda Matthews clutched her clipboard like a shield, while the board members pressed themselves against the wall. Emily Parker burst through the door, drawn by the commotion, with Father Michael close behind. "Get out," Emily commanded, her professional demeanor stripped away by urgency. "All of you who don't need to be here, get out now." She rushed to Tommy's bedside, checking his vitals even as medical equipment sparked and failed around her. Father Michael began to pray, his voice rising above the chaos. Sarah joined him, her rosary beads clicking rapidly through trembling fingers. The darkness in the room seemed to coalesce, forming shapes that defied natural law. You see, now Tommy's voice had changed again, becoming a child's voice layered with something else, something that made the air itself vibrate with menace. You see what happens when you try to interfere? The boy is ours, just like the others were ours. Just like dear Jessica. Father Michael's prayer faltered for just a moment, grief flashing across his face. In that instant, an invisible force sent him staggering backward. Emily caught him before he could fall, and as their hands touched, a surge of energy passed between them. The shadows recoiled, and Tommy screamed, his own voice this time, filled with terror and pain. "I see them," Emily gasped, her eyes wide. "Father, I see them clearly now, the shadows, the faces, all of them. There are so many children." Her voice broke as the visions overwhelmed her. "They're trapped here, all of them, decades of them." Dr. Harrison found his voice at last. "This is impossible," he stammered. "This can't be happening. Mrs. Miller, you'll be hearing from our legal department. And you, Father Davidson, are no longer welcome in this hospital." But his authoritative tone was undermined by the tremor in his voice and the way his eyes darted around the darkened room. Tommy's body suddenly went limp, the monitors settling into a steady rhythm. The shadows retreated to the corners, though they seemed to pulse with a malevolent awareness. Linda Matthews was the first to flee, followed closely by the board members. Dr. Harrison lingered in the doorway, his face a mix of fear and something else, guilt, perhaps, or recognition. "You know something about this," Father Michael said quietly, meeting the administrator's eyes. "About what happened to these children. About what happened to Jessica." Dr. Harrison's face hardened. "I know that this hospital has no place for superstition and hysteria. Mrs. Miller, consider this an official warning. Either accept conventional treatment for your son, or we'll be forced to take more drastic measures." As he turned to leave, Emily called after him. "The children," she said, her voice carrying a new authority. "I can see them following you, Dr. Harrison. They remember what happened to them, and they're waiting." The administrator's steps faltered for just a moment before he hurried away. Sarah collapsed into her chair, tears streaming down her face as she stroked Tommy's hair. The boy had fallen into an uneasy sleep, his face peaceful for the first time in days. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, looking between Father Michael and Sarah. The priest's face was grave as he considered their options. "Now," he said finally, "we prepare for war. Because after what happened today, they'll try to separate us. And if they succeed," he looked at Tommy's sleeping form, then at the shadows that still lurked in the corners. "If they succeed, we'll lose him just like we lost Jessica. And I won't let that happen. Not again." The following days brought a suffocating tension to St. Michael's Memorial. Dr. Harrison had stationed security guards outside Tommy's room, ostensibly for the boy's protection, but their watchful eyes followed Father Michael's every movement. Emily found her shifts rearranged, moving her away from the pediatric ward, though she refused to abandon her post. Sarah Miller received the custody hearing notice on a Tuesday morning. Her hands shook as she read the hospital's allegations: mental instability, religious delusions, medical neglect. They wanted to declare her unfit to take Tommy away. The court date was set for the following week, barely time to mount a defense. "They can't do this," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. She'd seen too many single mothers fight the system and lose. Emily stood beside her, reading the document over her shoulder, while Father Michael paced the small room, his expression dark. "Margaret," he addressed Dr. Sullivan, who had just entered the room, "you know what's really happening here. You were there with Jessica. Will you stand by again and watch another child suffer?" Dr. Sullivan's professional mask cracked slightly. "What happened to Jessica?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There were circumstances we didn't understand, but this is different. The hospital has protocols." "The same protocols that failed my daughter." Father Michael's voice carried 20 years of pain. "The same protocols that have failed every child who he stopped as Tommy stirred in his sleep, whimpering." Emily moved to check the boy's vitals, but as she touched his hand, a vision slammed into her with physical force. She saw them all, the children who had died in this hospital, their faces pressed against an invisible barrier, mouths open in silent screams. Among them, a young girl with Father Michael's eyes stared directly at her. "Jessica!" Emily gasped, staggering. "She's here! She's been here all along." The priest's face went pale, and even Dr. Sullivan took a step backward. "They're all here, trapped somehow, and they're trying to warn us." Before anyone could respond, Bobby Thompson, the night charge nurse, burst into the room. "You need to see this," he said, his usual calm demeanor shaken. He held up his phone, showing a news article from 20 years ago. The headline read, "St. Michael's Memorial faces investigation over child deaths records missing." "I've been looking into the hospital's history," Bobby explained. "There's a pattern. Every few years, children with unexplainable symptoms, always in this ward, always ending the same way, and always the records disappear." Dr. Sullivan sank into a chair, her professional composure finally crumbling. "I remember," she whispered. "Jessica wasn't the first, but after she died, when Father Michael started asking questions, Dr. Harrison said it was better to stay quiet, for the hospital's reputation, for our careers." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Tommy's monitors began their now familiar erratic beeping. The boy's eyes opened, but they were different this time, not the solid black of the malevolent force, but filled with tears. "They're so angry," he said in his own voice, though it carried echoes of others. "The lost ones, they were hurt here. He broke off as his body convulsed, fighting against something unseen." Emily grabbed his hand again, bracing for the vision. This time she saw flashes of the past: doctors in outdated uniforms, children strapped to beds, experiments performed in the name of medical advancement. She saw Jessica, terrified and alone, calling for her father. They were using them, Emily realized, horror dawning on her face. The hospital, they were experimenting on children. But something went wrong, something they couldn't control. "And now it has a taste for it," Father Michael finished grimly. "The darkness they invited in. It's still here, still hungry." He looked at his daughter's former doctor. "Margaret, you have to help us. The hearing is in a week. If they separate us from Tommy." Dr. Sullivan stood, squaring her shoulders. "I should have spoken up 20 years ago," she said. "Maybe if I had, Jessica," she couldn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. "I'll testify. About everything I know." Sarah clutched her son's hand tighter, tears streaming down her face. Bobby Thompson moved to guard the door. While Emily checked the window, they could all feel it coming, the darkness gathering for another attack. "They'll try to stop us," Father Michael warned. "The hospital, the board, they've covered this up for too long to let the truth come out now, and the darkness, it won't give up its claim easily." But as if in response to his words, the shadows in the room began to move against the natural fall of light. Tommy's body tensed, and the monitors screamed their electronic warning. The battle for his soul was far from over, but now they understood the true stakes, not just one boy's life, but justice for all the children who had suffered within these walls. They formed a circle around Tommy's bed, the priest who had lost everything, the nurse who could see the truth, the doctor carrying 20 years of guilt, the mother fighting for her son's life, and the charge nurse who had uncovered the past. Together they prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The truth began to unravel like a loose thread in an old sweater. Bobby Thompson's investigation had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and through it poured decades of carefully buried secrets. Working through sleepless nights, he and Emily pieced together a horrifying pattern stretching back to the hospital's founding. "Look at this," Bobby said one evening, spreading old newspapers across the break-room table. 1954, 6 children dead from mysterious ailments. 1972, 8 more cases. 1989, 12 cases, including 3 sets of siblings. And then, in 2004, Jessica. Emily finished softly, watching Father Michael's face tighten with pain. The priest had aged years in the past few days, the weight of revelation pressing down on his shoulders. Dr. Sullivan contributed her own pieces to the puzzle, finally breaking 20 years of silence. "The experimental treatments were always presented as last resorts," she explained, her voice heavy with guilt. Parents desperate for hope would sign anything. The hospital board called it advancing medical science, but the results, the children's reactions, it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Sarah listened from her vigil at Tommy's bedside, her son's hand clutched tightly in hers. The boy's condition had stabilized somewhat under their constant watch, but dark bruises still bloomed unexpectedly on his skin, and his moments of consciousness were increasingly filled with warnings about the hungry ones. Emily's newfound ability to see the hospital's trapped souls grew stronger each day. They followed her through the halls, transparent figures of children from different eras, their faces bearing witness to decades of suffering. Some tried to speak to her, their mouths moving in silent desperation. Others simply watched, their eyes holding terrible knowledge. The hospital administration's response to their investigation was swift and brutal. Emily found herself scheduled for competency evaluations. Bobby received written warnings about accessing old records. Dr. Sullivan faced threats of legal action for breaching confidentiality agreements signed decades ago. But it was Sarah who bore the brunt of their retaliation. Child services increased their visits, documenting every perceived irregularity in Tommy's care. Linda Matthews seemed to take particular pleasure in noting Sarah's religious fixation and delusional beliefs about supernatural entities. "They're building a case," Father Michael warned during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "Not just to take Tommy, but to discredit everyone involved. If we go public with what we found, they'll paint us all as unstable conspiracy theorists." Dr. Harrison's personal involvement became increasingly apparent. Security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned whenever he visited Tommy's floor. Staff members reported seeing him in the hospital archives late at night, emerging with boxes of old files that never reached their destination. One night, Emily caught him outside Tommy's room, speaking in hushed tones with a man she'd never seen before. The stranger wore an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the hospital corridor, and his presence made the shadows around him writhe unnaturally. "The board is concerned about liability," Emily overheard Harrison saying. "If Davidson keeps digging, if he finds proof of the program." "The situation will be handled," the stranger replied, his voice carrying an odd resonance that made Emily's skin crawl. "We've contained similar problems before. Though I must say, the boy shows remarkable potential. Such a shame to waste it." Emily's gift allowed her to see what others missed: the darkness that clung to both men like a second skin, the way the trapped souls fled from their presence, the hungry anticipation in the stranger's too wide smile. She understood then that they faced more than just institutional corruption. The hospital's dark history had attracted something ancient and malevolent, something that fed on suffering and innocence. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An elderly janitor named Frank Martinez approached Bobby one evening, glancing nervously over his shoulder as he pressed a key into the nurse's hand. "Sub-basement storage," Frank whispered. "Behind the old morgue. There's files down there ain't nobody supposed to find. My daddy worked here too, back in the 50s. He told me things. Things about what they did to those kids, about what they let in." That night, while Sarah and Father Michael kept vigil with Tommy, Emily and Bobby made their way to the sub-basement. The key opened a door that hadn't appeared on hospital blueprints for decades. Inside, hidden beneath years of dust and neglect, they found the evidence they'd been seeking: detailed records of experimental procedures, signed authorizations, and most damning of all, correspondence between hospital administrators and a mysterious organization known only as the Institute. They knew. Emily breathed, reading through the yellowed pages. They knew what was happening to the children. The experiments weren't just medical. They were trying to open something, trying to tap into some kind of power they didn't understand. The documents revealed a pattern of escalating darkness. What had begun as unauthorized medical experiments had evolved into something far more sinister. The hospital had become a feeding ground for an entity that promised knowledge and power in exchange for innocent souls. But as Bobby moved to photograph another page, a sound from the darkness froze them both: footsteps approaching, accompanied by the tap of an expensive cane on concrete. The stranger from the corridor had found them, and in the windowless room beneath the hospital, there was nowhere left to run. But the confrontation in the sub-basement changed everything. As the stranger's footsteps drew closer, Emily and Bobby huddled behind a stack of ancient filing cabinets, clutching their discovered evidence. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the sudden cold. But it was Emily's gift that revealed the true horror: shadows coalescing into forms that defied natural law, reaching for them with hungry intent. "Well, well," the stranger's voice echoed through the darkness. "It seems we have some rather inquisitive staff members." His expensive shoes came into view beneath the cabinet. "You know, curiosity has consequences in this place. Just ask all the others who came looking for answers." Bobby moved to shield Emily, but she grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with terror. Through her heightened sight, she could see them: the spirits of adults now, hospital staff, who had discovered too much over the decades, their faces frozen in eternal horror. They formed a grotesque honor guard around the stranger, a warning of what happened to those who questioned too deeply. Salvation came from an unexpected quarter. Above them, Tommy's voice rang through the hospital's power system, impossibly clear and carrying an authority that belonged to no child. "Leave them alone," the command echoed through the building's ancient bones, and the shadows recoiled. Emily and Bobby seized their chance, running past the momentarily stunned stranger. They emerged from the sub-basement to find the hospital in chaos. Every light was flashing, every monitor screaming electronic distress. They raced to Tommy's room, where they found the boy sitting upright in bed, his eyes glowing with an inner light that seemed to hold the encroaching darkness at bay. Father Michael and Sarah stood on either side of him, their prayers creating a barrier against the shadows that clawed at the windows. "He's getting stronger," Father Michael explained, his voice filled with equal parts hope and fear. "But so are they. They know we found proof of what they've done. They won't stop now." Dr. Sullivan burst into the room, her professional composure shattered. "Harrison's called an emergency board meeting," she gasped. "They're voting to have Tommy forcibly transferred to another facility. They're saying—" She paused, catching her breath. "They're saying it's for a specialist consultation, but I saw the paperwork. It's the institute. They're going to take him to the same place they took the others." The next hours passed in a blur of desperate activity. Bobby began digitizing the documents they'd discovered, sending copies to every news outlet and law enforcement agency he could think of. Emily, her sensitivity now heightened beyond ignore, worked with Father Michael to establish protective measures around Tommy's room. Dr. Sullivan used her credentials to delay the transfer orders, buying them precious time. Sarah never left her son's side, her faith providing an anchor as Tommy drifted between consciousness and something else, moments when his voice carried the weight of all the lost children, when his eyes held knowledge no 8-year-old should possess. "They're getting ready," he would whisper in these moments. "They've waited so long. They're so hungry." The hospital staff began taking sides. Some, like Frank the janitor, brought them supplies and information. Others turned away, fear of losing their jobs overriding their conscience. A few actively worked against them, reporting their movements to Harrison and his mysterious associates. Dr. Sullivan finally confessed the full truth about Jessica's death. "We knew the patterns even then," she told Father Michael, tears streaming down her face. "Children with unusual symptoms, unexplainable complications, and always that presence in the room, that feeling of something watching, waiting. I should have warned you. I should have stopped them. But I was afraid." The priest's response surprised them all. "Fear is their weapon," he said quietly. "Fear kept us silent, kept us blind. But love," he looked at Sarah, still holding Tommy's hand, at Emily using her gift, despite the terror it brought, at Bobby risking his career to expose the truth. "Love makes us brave." As night fell, they could feel the hospital's dark history pressing in around them. The souls of lost children gathered closer, drawn to Tommy's light like moths to a flame. Through Emily's enhanced sight, they could see the truth. The boy had become a nexus, a focal point for decades of pain and horror, but also for resistance, for hope. "Tomorrow," Father Michael announced, looking at their small band of allies. "Tomorrow the board meets to decide Tommy's fate. Tomorrow Harrison and his friends will try to take him. And tomorrow we make our stand." They spent the night preparing, gathering evidence, strengthening their defenses, reaching out to anyone who might help. But they all felt it, the darkness gathering its strength, the hungry shadows growing bolder. The final battle for Tommy's soul would cost them dearly, and not everyone in that room would live to see its end. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., but the battle began at midnight. Tommy woke screaming, his body arching off the bed as shadows poured through the walls like liquid darkness. The temperature plummeted so severely that ice crystals formed on the windows, creating ghostly patterns that seemed to show faces in their depths. "They're coming," Tommy's voice echoed with the cries of countless children. "They're all coming, the doctors, the shadows, the hungry ones." His eyes rolled back, showing only whites as his small body convulsed against the restraints they'd reluctantly placed to keep him safe. Father Michael began to pray, his voice strong despite his exhaustion. Sarah clutched her rosary with one hand and her son's fingers with the other, her prayers joining the priest's in a desperate harmony. Emily stood at the foot of the bed, her enhanced sight showing her horrors that the others could only sense, the walls between worlds growing thin, dark shapes, pressing against reality like hands against a membrane about to tear. Dr. Harrison arrived first, flanked by security guards and the stranger in the expensive suit. "This ends now," Harrison announced, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to make the shadows dance. "Mrs. Miller, you're hereby relieved of medical decision-making rights for your son. Security will escort you out." But as the guards moved forward, Bobby Thompson stepped into the doorway, his massive frame blocking their path. Dr. Sullivan stood beside him, holding up her phone. "One call," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "One call to the press. They're already asking questions about the old records, about the pattern of deaths. How much attention do you want on this hospital right now?" The stranger stepped forward, his smile too wide, too full of teeth. "Dear Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that unnatural resonance that made spirits flee. "Always the conscience of St. Michael's. Tell me, how well did that work out for little Jessica? For all the others you failed to save?" Father Michael's prayers grew louder, and Tommy suddenly spoke not in his own voice, not in the voice of the darkness, but in Jessica's. "Daddy," she called through her brother's lips. "Daddy, I understand now. I know why they chose me. Why they chose all of us." The priest faltered, tears streaming down his face, but his prayers never stopped. Emily gasped as her vision shifted, showing her the truth in all its horror. The hospital records, the experiments, the decades of suffering, it had all been building to this moment. They were preparing him, she realized aloud. All of them, all these years. Testing, experimenting, feeding the darkness until they found the perfect vessel. Tommy's not just another victim, he's what they've been waiting for. The stranger's smile grew impossibly wider. "Very good, my dear. Such perception. The Institute has waited so long for a child like Tommy, strong enough to contain what we wish to bring through, pure enough to feed their hunger. The others were just practice, stepping stones." Sarah stood, placing herself between the intruders and her son's bed. "You can't have him," she declared, her voice ringing with maternal fury. "I don't care what you are, what power you serve. He's my son." The shadows surged forward, and Emily screamed as she saw the truth behind them. Hundreds of faces, doctors and nurses and administrators stretching back decades, all who had served the Institute's dark purpose willingly. Their collective were pressed against the barriers of reality, trying to reach Tommy. But they weren't alone in the room. As Father Michael's prayers reached a crescendo, other spirits emerged, the lost children, led by Jessica, forming a circle of light around Tommy's bed. Their sacrifice had bound them to this place, but their innocence had preserved their power to resist. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his face twisted with an emotion that might have been regret. "You don't understand what's at stake," he said. "The knowledge we've gained, the power we've been promised. Every sacrifice brought us closer to understanding the true nature of life, of death, of the soul itself." Understanding, Dr. Sullivan's voice cracked with disgust. "You tortured children. You fed them to this thing you invited in. And now you want Tommy too." The stranger raised his hand, and darkness exploded through the room. Bobby was thrown against a wall, Dr. Sullivan knocked to her knees. But at Tommy's bedside, Sarah and Father Michael stood firm, their faith creating a barrier that even the shadows couldn't penetrate. Emily found herself caught between worlds, her gift showing her both the physical battle and the spiritual war being waged around them. In that moment she made a choice that would change everything. She reached for Tommy's hand, opening herself fully to her ability, offering herself as a channel for all the lost souls of St. Michael's Memorial. The moment Emily touched Tommy's hand, the hospital erupted into chaos. Light and darkness clashed as decades of trapped spirits surged through her, using her connection to manifest fully in our world. The lost children's voices rose in a chorus that shattered every window on the floor, their combined pain and hope creating a force that made the very foundations of St. Michael's Memorial tremble. "Get away from my son," Sarah's voice cut through the cacophony, her maternal love blazing like a physical force. The stranger staggered back, his perfect composure cracking for the first time. Dr. Harrison collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as the weight of his sins pressed down on him. Bobby Thompson recovered first, launching his considerable bulk at the security guards who still blocked the doorway. Dr. Sullivan scrambled for her phone, broadcasting the supernatural chaos live to every news contact she had. "The world needs to see," she gasped. "They need to know what happened here." Father Michael's prayers reached a fever pitch, and suddenly Jessica stood beside him not as a spirit, but almost solid, her hand clasped in her father's. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos, "we can help Tommy. All of us. That's why we stayed. We were waiting for him." The stranger snarled, his human facade crumbling to reveal something ancient and terrible. "You think your faith can stop what's coming? We've fed this place with suffering for generations. The darkness has grown too strong." His words made reality itself buckle, and more shadows poured through the walls. But Tommy sat up in his bed, his eyes glowing with an inner light that seemed to draw strength from every soul in the room. "No," he said, his 8-year-old voice layered with countless others. "You didn't make us weak, you made us strong. Every child you hurt, every life you stole, we're all connected now. And we're not afraid anymore." Emily felt the truth of it through her gift. Every cruel experiment, every death had been meant to create fear and pain to feed the darkness. Instead, it had forged bonds between the victims, a network of souls united in their resistance. Tommy wasn't just a vessel for evil, he was a catalyst for redemption. The stranger raised his hands, darkness gathering around him like a cloak. "Then you'll all suffer together," but before he could strike, a new voice rang out from the doorway. Frank Martinez stood there, clutching a stack of ancient files. "I brought them," he announced. "Every record my daddy saved, every name of everyone involved. It's over. The police are coming. The bishop is coming. Everyone will know what happened here." The stranger's attack faltered as his carefully constructed web of secrets began to unravel. Dr. Harrison looked around wildly, seeing decades of cover-ups crumbling. But the darkness wasn't finished. It lashed out in desperate fury, trying to claim Tommy before its chance was lost. Sarah threw herself over her son as shadows whipped through the air like razor blades. Father Michael's prayers never faltered, even as cuts appeared on his face and hands. Emily stood her ground, channeling the power of every lost soul into a barrier of pure light. And then Tommy began to sing. It was an old hymn, one his mother had taught him, but as his voice rose, other voices joined in: the lost children, the trapped spirits, even Jessica. The sound filled the hospital with something the darkness couldn't fight: hope. The stranger screamed in rage and frustration as his power began to fade. The shadows retreated, pulling back from the light that now emanated from every corner of the room. Dr. Harrison backed away, his face a mask of terror as he realized his protectors were abandoning him. "This isn't possible," the stranger hissed, his form becoming less human by the second. "We had a deal. We had decades of deals." "Deals built on suffering," Father Michael responded, his voice strong. "Deals paid for with innocent blood. But love is stronger than any contract with darkness. And these children." He looked around at the spirits visible now to everyone in the room. These children never lost their capacity to love. The final confrontation happened in an instant. The stranger lunged for Tommy, darkness incarnate reaching for one last chance at victory. But he never reached the bed. Every spirit in St. Michael's memorial, every soul that had suffered within its walls, joined together in one moment of perfect unity. The light they created didn't just drive back the darkness, it cleansed it. Victory came at a devastating price. As the light faded and reality settled back into its proper shape, the true cost of their battle became clear. Emily Parker lay unconscious beside Tommy's bed, blood trickling from her nose and ears. The strain of channeling so many spirits had taken a terrible toll on her mind and body. Bobby Thompson slumped against the wall, his breathing labored from injuries sustained, protecting them from security. But it was Father Michael who bore the greatest immediate cost. The priest stood frozen, his hand still extended toward where Jessica's spirit had last been visible. The effort of maintaining the connection between worlds, of holding his daughter's spirit in quasi-corporeal form one last time, had shattered something essential within him. His eyes stared unseeing, his lips moving in prayers no one else could hear. The damage. "It's not just physical," Dr. Sullivan said softly, checking Emily's vital signs. "What they did here, what we allowed to happen, it broke something fundamental. In the hospital, in all of us." Her hands trembled as she worked, the weight of her long silence finally crushing her professional composure. The aftermath brought more devastating revelations. As police swarmed the hospital, as reporters gathered outside like vultures, the full scope of St. Michael's Memorial's crimes began to emerge. Frank Martinez's records revealed not dozens but hundreds of children sacrificed over the decades. Each file told a story of innocence betrayed, of pain justified in the name of progress. Dr. Harrison had vanished in the chaos, but he left behind evidence of his own guilt, detailed journals documenting every sacrifice, every dark ritual, every deal made with forces beyond human understanding. The entries became increasingly erratic near the end, speaking of voices in the walls and shadows that moved with purpose. Sarah sat beside Tommy's bed, watching her son sleep naturally for the first time in weeks, but her relief was tainted by the knowledge that he would never be the same. The boy stirred restlessly, whimpering names of children long dead, his innocence scarred by memories that no child should carry. "He sees them all now," she whispered, to no one in particular. "Every child, every death, every moment of fear and pain. How do I help him live with that?" No one had an answer for her. The hospital's board members were found in the conference room, but not as anyone expected. The morning's emergency meeting had turned into a scene of horror. Each board member sat in their usual place, their faces frozen in expressions of terminal realization. The official cause of death would later be listed as heart failure, but those who saw the bodies knew the truth: they had died of fear, confronted by the consequences of their decades of complicity. Dr. Sullivan's career ended that day, her medical license surrendered voluntarily. "I can't practice anymore," she explained, her voice hollow. "Not after knowing what we did in the name of medicine. Not after seeing how we failed those children." She aged years in those few hours, the weight of suppressed guilt finally breaking her. The most heart-wrenching tragedy lay in the spirits themselves. Though the darkness had been driven back, the souls of the lost children remained bound to St. Michael's Memorial. Their sacrifice and suffering had created bonds too deep to break. They would never find rest, never move on to whatever peace might have awaited them. Jessica's final words to her father echoed through the halls, a ghostly reminder of their Pyrrhic victory. "We chose this, Daddy. We chose to stay, to wait, to fight. But the price was everything we were, everything we might have been." Father Michael's response, when he finally spoke again, carried the weight of 2 decades of grief. No parent should outlive their child, but to lose her twice, to hold her again, only to watch her fade. "God forgive me, I don't know if my faith is strong enough for this." The days following the confrontation brought wave after wave of devastating revelations. The Institute's reach proved far deeper than anyone had imagined. As federal investigators combed through decades of hospital records, they uncovered a network of similar facilities across the country, each harboring its own dark secrets, each contributing to a grand design that defied comprehension. Emily Parker remained in a coma for 3 days. When she finally woke, her gift had intensified beyond control. Every spirit, every echo of past suffering was now visible to her constantly. She could no longer walk the hospital corridors without seeing the endless parade of lost souls, could no longer close her eyes without witnessing decades of torment played out in vivid detail. "I can't turn it off," she sobbed to Bobby, who kept vigil by her bedside despite his own injuries. "They're all here, all the time. Not just the children, everyone who ever suffered, ever died in pain or fear. How do I live with this? How do I help them when I can barely help myself?" The local churches filled with mourners and seekers of answers. Father Michael's absence was conspicuous, his small parish now led by a younger priest who couldn't understand why his predecessor had seemingly abandoned his flock. Few knew that the older priest spent his days in Tommy's room, caught between grief and duty, between the daughter he'd lost twice and the boy who still needed his protection. Sarah Miller faced her own battle in the courts. Though the evidence of supernatural events was undeniable, the legal system struggled to process what had happened. Child Services, embarrassed by their role in the hospital's attempts to separate mother and son, now demanded extensive psychological evaluations of both Sarah and Tommy. "They want to make sure we're processing our trauma appropriately," Sarah explained bitterly to Dr. Sullivan during one of their many late-night conversations. "As if there's an appropriate way to process finding out your child was meant to be a vessel for ancient evil." The media descended like locusts, each reporter hoping to break the next shocking detail. They camped outside the hospital, outside Sarah's small apartment, outside the church. Every person involved in Tommy's case became a target for their relentless questioning. The truth, when printed in black and white, seemed simultaneously too fantastic to believe and too horrific to deny. Bobby Thompson's role as a whistleblower earned him both praise and condemnation. His nursing license was suspended pending investigation, though few believed he would ever return to healthcare. "Some things you can't unsee," told the review board. "Some wrongs you can't make right. All you can do is make sure they never happen again." Most tragic was the impact on Tommy himself. Though physically recovered, the boy would wake screaming from nightmares filled with memories that weren't his own. He could name every child who had died in the hospital, could describe in detail the experiments they had endured. His drawings, once bright and hopeful, now depicted shadows and spirits and faces twisted in eternal anguish. Dr. Sullivan, stripped of her medical credentials, devoted herself to cataloguing every victim, every experiment, every death. The task consumed her, aged her, but she refused to stop. "I kept silent for 20 years, she explained to anyone who would listen. "I won't be silent anymore, even if the truth destroys me." The hospital itself became a tomb. Though officially still operating, no patient would willingly seek treatment there. The pediatric ward was permanently closed, its rooms sealed off. At night, staff reported hearing children's voices, seeing shadows move against the light, feeling small hands reach for them in empty corridors. Father Michael's faith, once unshakable, now wavered under the weight of what he'd witnessed. "How do we reconcile this?" he asked during one of his increasingly rare sermons. "How do we believe in a loving God when such darkness exists? When children suffer, and the guilty escape, and justice seems more like a fairy tale we tell ourselves to sleep at night." The tragedy wasn't just in what had happened, but in what could never be undone. The lost children would never rest, the guilty would never fully pay for their crimes, and those who had fought the darkness would never completely heal from their wounds, visible and invisible alike. The truth emerged not with a bang but with a whimper 3 weeks after the confrontation. Frank Martinez's son, working through his father's personal effects, found a safety deposit box key. Inside the box lay decades of carefully preserved evidence, photographs, letters, and most damning of all, a leather-bound journal belonging to the hospital's founding director, Dr. Jonathan Wells. The journal revealed a truth more horrifying than anyone had imagined. St. Michael's Memorial hadn't simply been corrupted over time, it had been built for darkness. Every brick, every corridor, every room had been designed according to ancient geometries meant to thin the barriers between worlds. The children's suffering hadn't been an unfortunate byproduct of unethical experiments, it had been the purpose all along. The Institute was never interested in medical advancement, Emily explained from her hospital bed, her enhanced sight allowing her to read layers of truth in the old documents. They were building a conduit, a gateway. Each child's pain, each death, was another brick in their construction. Tommy wasn't just their latest victim, he was meant to be their keystone. The revelation hit Father Michael particularly hard. Jessica wasn't chosen randomly, he realized, his voice breaking. They chose her because of me, because of my faith. They wanted to see if a child's suffering could break not just a parent's heart, but their belief in God itself. The priest's hands trembled as he clutched his collar, understanding at last why he'd been drawn back to this place, to this battle. Dr. Sullivan's own role became painfully clear. She hadn't been selected for her medical skills, but for her potential for guilt, for her capacity to recognize wrong but choose silence. Every doctor, every nurse who had participated over the years had been carefully chosen for similar traits, good people who could be led down the path to darkness one small compromise at a time. The stranger who had vanished during the confrontation was identified in Wells's journal as Mr. Gray, an ageless figure who had guided the hospital's dark purpose for generations. Photographs spanning decades showed him unchanged, his too wide smile and expensive suits a constant as the world aged around him. Sarah found her own connection to the conspiracy. Her husband's abandonment hadn't been his choice. He had been eliminated by the Institute when they realized Tommy's potential. His car accident, ruled a suicide, had been orchestrated to leave Tommy more vulnerable, more open to the darkness they planned to channel through him. Bobby Thompson discovered his own unwitting part in their plans. His position as night-charge nurse, his tendency to look the other way, his very presence had been orchestrated years in advance. They placed us like chess pieces, he realized. All of us playing our parts in their game without even knowing the rules. The most stunning revelation came from Tommy himself. During one of his more lucid moments, he drew a series of pictures that, when arranged correctly, formed a blueprint of the hospital's true design. The pediatric ward formed the center of a massive occult symbol, with other departments positioned to channel energy toward it. Every room where a child had died was marked in his drawings with perfect accuracy, though he had never seen the hospital's full layout. They didn't want to just open a door, Emily explained, looking at Tommy's drawings with her enhanced sight. They wanted to break down the wall between worlds completely. Each death, each moment of suffering was meant to weaken the barrier, if they had succeeded. She couldn't finish the sentence, but the implications were clear. The discovery vindicated their actions but offered little comfort. The truth behind St. Michael's Memorial was too vast, too terrible to fully comprehend. It reached beyond the hospital, beyond the Institute, into shadows that had waited since the beginning of time for someone to invite them in. Justice came in unexpected forms. Dr. Harrison was found in a motel room 50 miles away, surrounded by hospital records and rambling letters confessing to decades of crimes. His death was ruled a heart attack, but those who saw the body noted the expression of absolute terror frozen on his face, and the way shadows seemed to linger in the room long after the body was removed. The Institute's facade of respectability crumbled as investigations spread. Similar patterns emerged at hospitals across the country, children's wards designed to ancient specifications, unexplained deaths, and connections to mysterious benefactors with too wide smiles. Federal agents found offices empty, records destroyed, and employees who couldn't quite remember who they had worked for or why. But the most profound revelation came from an unexpected source. During one of his more lucid moments, Tommy looked at Father Michael and spoke with Jessica's voice one final time. "Daddy, we let them think they were winning. All these years they thought they were building their gateway. But we were building something too." Emily's gift allowed her to see the truth. Every child's death had indeed created a connection, but not the one the Institute had intended. Instead of weakening the barrier between worlds, their shared suffering had forged bonds of resistance, a network of united souls stronger than any darkness. The Institute thought fear and pain would break us, Tommy explained, his young voice carrying ancient wisdom. But they didn't understand love. Each child they hurt became part of something bigger. We learned to protect each other. We learned to wait. We chose Tommy because he could bring it all together. Sarah wept as she understood her son's true role. He hadn't been chosen as a vessel for darkness, but as a catalyst for light. His capacity for love, strengthened by his mother's unwavering faith and devotion, had made him the perfect channel for generations of united resistance. Dr. Sullivan found her own redemption in this truth. Her years of guilty silence had positioned her perfectly to help expose the Institute's crimes. They thought they were corrupting us, she realized. But even in our weakness, even in our fear, we were being prepared for this moment. Bobby Thompson discovered that his tendency to look the other way had allowed him to see things others missed. His late-night investigations, his careful documentation, had created a record that would ensure the Institute's crimes would never be forgotten or repeated. The lost children began to appear differently to Emily's enhanced sight. Their faces no longer showed only pain and fear, but determination and triumph. They had sacrificed everything, endured unimaginable suffering, to create a foundation of resistance that would ultimately defeat the very darkness meant to consume them. Frank Martinez's lifetime of collecting evidence suddenly made sense. He hadn't been just a janitor but a guardian, carefully preserving the truth until the right moment. His seeming subservience had been a cover for decades of patient opposition. Even Father Michael's crisis of faith was revealed as part of a greater purpose. His daughter's death, though tragic, had positioned him to understand and fight a darkness that his previous life of certainty could never have prepared him for. His wavering belief had made his faith stronger, more resilient, more capable of facing genuine evil. The hospital itself began to feel different. Though still haunted, the spirits now moved with purpose rather than pain. The shadows retreated from certain rooms, particularly those where acts of compassion and resistance had taken place over the years. "We won," Tommy said simply, holding his mother's hand. "Not just us here, but all of them, everywhere." The Institute thought they were building something dark, but they really built their own defeat. They just didn't see it until it was too late. This final truth transformed their understanding of everything that had happened. Their victory hadn't been a last-minute miracle, but the culmination of decades of quiet resistance, of small acts of love and courage in the face of overwhelming darkness. The Institute's carefully constructed plan had been undone not by force or power, but by the very thing they had dismissed as weakness: human connection, compassion, and undying hope. St. Michael's Memorial Hospital closed its doors permanently 1 year after the confrontation. The building was demolished, but not before Father Michael led a service of remembrance on the grounds. Hundreds gathered: former patients, staff members, families of the lost children, each holding a candle against the gathering dark. Tommy, now 9, stood between his mother and Emily Parker, his small hand raised in farewell to the spirits only he and Emily could still see. The lost children appeared one final time, led by Jessica, their faces peaceful as the walls that had trapped them for so long came down. The demolition wasn't just of brick and mortar, but of decades of trapped pain and fear. Emily had learned to live with her enhanced sight, transforming what had once been a curse into a gift of healing. She opened a counseling center for families dealing with trauma, her ability to see beyond the physical allowing her to help in ways others couldn't. The spirits that had once tormented her became allies in healing, teaching her that pain shared could become pain transformed. Father Michael found his way back to faith, though changed forever. His sermons now spoke not of blind belief but of tested conviction, of light that meant more because it had faced true darkness. Jessica's memory became not a wound but a source of strength, her sacrifice part of a greater victory than he could have imagined. Sarah and Tommy built a new life, supported by the unlikely family forged in their darkest hours. Bobby Thompson became a constant presence, his protective instincts finding a new purpose. Dr. Sullivan, though no longer practicing medicine, dedicated herself to documenting stories of survival and resistance. The Institute's other facilities were discovered and closed, their dark purposes exposed to light, but more importantly their legacy of fear was transformed. Each revelation of their crimes brought forward more survivors, more stories of quiet resistance, more proof that love and courage could flourish even in the darkest places. Tommy's drawings changed too. While he still drew the spirits, they were no longer trapped in shadow but surrounded by light. They're free now, he explained to anyone who asked. Not gone, but choosing to stay, to help, to protect. The demolition crew found one final piece of evidence in the hospital's foundations, a small diary written by a nurse in 1954. Her last entry read, "They think they're building something dark here, but they don't see what's really growing. In every act of compassion, every moment of resistance, every hand held in the night, we're building too. And love builds stronger walls than fear." 10 years after St. Michael's Memorial fell, Tommy Miller graduated high school as valedictorian. His speech touched on themes that few in the audience could fully understand, but all could feel the power of unity in the face of darkness, the strength found in shared suffering, and the triumph of love over fear. Sarah sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, surrounded by their chosen family, Emily Parker, whose gift had become legendary among those who needed help finding peace with the past. Father Michael, grey but unbowed, his faith now a blend of wisdom and hard-won truth. Bobby Thompson, who had turned his protective instincts into a program helping at-risk youth. Dr. Sullivan, whose documentation of the hospital's history had become a testament to both human darkness and resilience. The ground where St. Michael's Memorial once stood became a memorial garden. Flowers bloomed where darkness had once gathered, and children played without fear in spaces that had once housed unimaginable suffering. The lost souls, though still present, had become guardians rather than prisoners, their eternal watch transformed from a curse into a choice. Emily's counseling center, built nearby, became a beacon for those dealing with trauma and loss. "Pain shared is pain transformed," read the plaque by its door, and those who entered found healing in the understanding that they were not alone in their struggles. The Institute's legacy changed too. What was meant to be a network of darkness became a chain of light, as survivors connected, shared their stories, and transformed their suffering into strength. Each exposed facility became a center for healing, their architectural geometry of pain repurposed for peace. But Tommy kept his ability to see and communicate with spirits, but it no longer brought terror. Instead, it became a bridge between past and present, pain and healing, loss and love. The lost children, led always by Jessica, remained connected to him not through suffering but through choice and purpose. Father Michael's final sermon before retirement spoke to the heart of what they had all learned. Faith isn't about never doubting, but about finding light even in the darkest places. Love isn't about never feeling fear, but about choosing to stand firm despite it. And hope isn't about never facing darkness, but about building something stronger than darkness can destroy. Sarah Miller's journey from desperate mother to pillar of strength became a symbol for others facing impossible battles. Her unfailing love for her son had not only saved Tommy but had helped create a foundation for healing that would continue for generations. The last page of Dr. Sullivan's comprehensive documentation of St. Michael's Memorial ended with words that captured the essence of their shared journey. In the end, what defeated darkness wasn't power or knowledge or even faith alone. It was the simple, unstoppable force of human hearts connecting, sharing strength, and refusing to let go of love even in the darkest night. That's the real miracle that happened here. At its heart, this story reminds us that the greatest battles aren't always fought with weapons or power, but with the quiet strength of human connection and unwavering love. In the darkest places, where evil seems insurmountable and hope feels foolish, it's the small acts of compassion, the stubborn refusal to let go, and the courage to stand together that ultimately prevail. The children of St. Michael's Memorial teach us that suffering shared can become strength multiplied, that faith tested can emerge stronger than faith unchallenged, and that even in our darkest moments, we're never truly alone. Their legacy reminds us that while darkness may seem patient and powerful, love builds quietly but inexorably, creating bonds that no shadow can break. In the end, what defeats evil isn't just the light we carry, but our determination to share that light with others, especially when the night seems darkest. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey through St. Michael's Memorial. If you were moved by this story, please consider subscribing to our channel to support our team of storytellers. Share this video with friends and family who appreciate deep, meaningful narratives. Your likes and comments mean the world to us. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings about Tommy's story in the comments below. Should we explore what happens next? Would you like to hear about the other facilities and the children who fought back? Let us know if you're ready for part 2. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to light.